So before we actually commence making our floor plank material, I want to do a couple of things to this original wood that we made. One of them has to do with the floor planks, and the other one has to do with the fact that as I was doing the testing on it after the original videos, there's a couple of things that bugged me about it. Namely, the roughness. I don't want it to go all the way up to 1 in the formula that we made. So what's happening is that it's going completely rough, and even rough wood doesn't go completely rough. So to change that, that's like a minor tweak in here. We'll go into our values. We'll go into our level out high. And I'm going to get a new constant. And instead of using this number 1, I'm going to put in, for the shinier bits, we'll put in 0.917. So it's not quite 1. And when I was looking at it in Unreal, that number actually worked pretty well. Then we can go down to the rougher one and do the same thing. And as it turns out, this value I came up with was 0.971. And we'll replace that. And related to that, I also went into the height. And in here, I'm going to let it go as high as it wants to as far as lightness, because what I want to do is I want to create more height differential. And then also come in here and adjust this so that it's lighter. And this is going to give me a bumpier wood because it was looking really smooth and flat. I'm going to take a quick look and see how this looks when we move that polish down, or up rather. So at its highest, it's nice and relatively flat in here. So that's good. That's what I want. And finally, I want to tone down these splinters a bit. And I'm going to do that in a couple of ways. First thing is we're going to make a mask. And I'm going to get an invert grayscale, and we're going to take this warp right here, and we're going to invert it, and then we're going to get a levels node to get rid of some of those intermediate grays to make it more of a mask. Still want some fuzziness on the edges because we're using it for those splinters, so you don't want like a straight line, but tighten it up a bit. And then we're going to use it as a mask for what we're going to sort of kind of replace in this blend. And that's already toned it down a little bit because it's cutting it out from these very high bits. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of change the way that I'm applying the actual noise. First thing is I'm going to get another invert grayscale, and we'll invert this one and get another levels node and get those lines darker. And we'll get a blend node and a color, which we'll just turn to a grayscale and make it white. I'll use that as the background. I'll dock it by hitting the letter D. And we will now get this purlin to use as a mask. In fact, let's highlight that noodle, get a levels node in there, and really cut some of those way out. So now we don't have those splinters everywhere. We only have them in places. And I'm now going to replace just this direct line in here. And because now we're dealing with a light, well, with a positive image, I'm going to change the blending from lighten to multiply. And what it's doing then, it's having our scratches dig in as opposed to pop up, which is what they were doing the last time. So we've kind of inverted the direction of the scratches. And that takes care of the aesthetic issues that I was having with it. And I think it looks better because the scratches are kind of limited to being more in the area of the rings. And the renderer in here, it still looks kind of flat, but when I was looking at it Unreal, the roughness and the height were working pretty well. And of course, you can always take your own materials and suit them to taste. Now, what I want to address is the thing that actually has to do with making our floor planks. If you remember, in our plank mask, we set up this color ID. And what this is going to allow us to do is to actually feed in 3 different materials that we can apply against all this other stuff. If we went ahead, I mean, we could just go ahead and apply the planks mask directly onto this wood. But if we did that, then all these rings, it would look like we just took a mask and put it onto a single piece of wood. It wouldn't look like they're different pieces of wood. Now, when you have a floor, it's all like from the same tree, but they're not all identical. So what I want to do here is set up one more input parameter that's going to take this material and pan it on the X and the Y. And this way, we can set up 3 different iterations of the same material and have each one of them be in a slightly different position, which will give us the impression of having different pieces of wood. And this is actually a super simple thing to do. We're going to get a transform 2D node. We're going to double click on our graph. We're going to make a new input parameter. We'll call this material pan, and we'll make it a float 2. And I'll set the default as 0. And then we'll set the minimum, well, actually we'll set it both at 0, and then we'll set the minimum at -1 and the maximum at 1. And this will allow us to move it in a couple of directions. I'm going to come into my transform 2D, I'm going to go into my offset and hit matte pan. And that's it. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more copies, and we'll hook them up. So now we can take this material and shift it around. And this will give us much better looking planks because it'll look like different pieces of wood. So now we're ready to make our floor material. So I'm going to come up in here. We're going to make a new substance. We'll call this basic floor. And we'll leave it at the PBR default. And at this point, things get pretty easy because we've done all the heavy lifting by making the underlying material in the mask, and now all we need to do is link the two of them together. So I'm going to get a multi-material blend, and this is a blend that allows me to blend more than one material. Its default is set to 2, but if we get into the actual node itself, we can determine how many materials we want to have in here, and we're actually going to want 3. Now you'll notice down here there's a color ID, and this is where the color ID that we made previously is going to come in. So I'm actually going to come into my demo workspace, and we're going to pick up our basic wood, and we're going to pick up our plank mask. And we can start plugging things in. Now, the reason we put that pan in there was so that we didn't have to use, I mean, we could go ahead and do, just one piece of wood and just lay it on top. I'm going to actually make 2 more of these. And if you look closely, you'll see that what we have set in here doesn't 100% match what's going on in here, and that's because the other thing that we need to do in our multi-material blend is to set up the channels. Now, it's got a wide selection of channels to choose from, and we're just going to toggle them on and off. We're not using a diffuse. We need a base color, we need a normal, we need a specular. We do not need a glossiness, and we do not need a metallic. We do need a specular level, and we don't need a specular, because this is a color and we're using the grayscale specular level. Ambient occlusion we do need, and opacity we don't. And now these match these, and for some reason it doesn't like doing that ambient occlusion automatically. Don't know why, but they do hook up. I mean, you just have to do it twice. And there we go. So this material is now hooked in according to this color mask, but not really, because we need to first assign the actual colors. Now you'll notice we have 3 materials in here, but it's only giving us color assignment information for number 2 and number 3. And that means number 1 it's using as the background. So we only pick 2 of these colors, doesn't really matter which, to assign to the top 2 materials. What I'm going to do is I'm going to double click on my mask. I'll get it nice and big, and this gives me a sampling of the colors that I want, because it's going to want exact colors. Then I'm going to single click on my material, multi-material blend, to try to get a little bit more room, and I'm going to go into my material 2, so that corresponds to this one. I'm going to get the color picker, and I will pick a color. And then I'll do the same thing to the next one, and I'll pick this blue. Now, at the moment, they're still all the same. But now, if we have this actual mixed result in our window here, and I single click on one of these, as I pan it, you can see that we're changing the way the wood is, and it's doing it according to this. Now notice in here we're still getting a little bit of weirdness. You want to be careful with this, because doing too much will actually make it transparent. But in each one of these material blend color sections, there's a thing called fuzziness. And if you ramp that up just a wee bit, it's going to sort of, it's not going to take it quite as seriously as it would if that was down at 0. But if you do too much of that, then you start to see the things underneath it, so you have to be very careful. But it's good for just kind of getting rid of like really small artifacting like this, which is why when we made this mask, I tried to do as much of it as I could at that end, because using the fuzziness is really only for the very fine tuning. And we can kind of do the same thing to this one. What did we have this set as? 0.03. So we'll set this to 0.03 as well. And that should get rid of that artifacting for us without actually creating too much trouble with seeing things underneath. And finally, why don't we just pan this one? And now we've got these different strata, and it's actually starting to look like different pieces of wood, and it's doing it according to these parameters that we set in. So we know that every one of these, whether we're using the masks on top or the color ID, it's all working along the same numbers, so they'll change together. Now we have to, before we hook them up and have this work, we actually have to expose our parameters. I'm going to expose just, I mean, we could go ahead and create a new parameter in here, but since we planned ahead, we're actually, all we need to do is expose it. And if I double click on my graph, it's appeared here, and the label has been set, and it looks good. So now I can just go ahead and use it to assign it everywhere else I need it, including here. Now, I'm not going to expose these two because I don't feel like it. But if you want to expose these as well and have them available in the game engine, then by all means go ahead and do it. So now if we were to plug this in, we forgot to change our output nodes here. Why don't we go ahead and do that now? I'm going to switch this to our specular level. And we'll make a new ambient occlusion. And we now have our wood material. It looks a bit different because it's got those striations in it, but this is essentially the same thing that we did in the other graph. And now it's really as simple as just hooking up these two together using blend nodes in through here. So I'll move, that's kind of irritating, this here. So let's start with the color. What I'm going to do here, I'm going to bring in a hue saturation lightness node, and I'm going to create a slightly darker version of that color. And we're going to use our lines mask. I believe it's the one on top. I should probably have given it a better name. I think it's that one. No, that's our height map. So it's this one. And the reason we can't see it is actually because it's too low res. Those lines are very fine. Now we can see it. And we'll put this as our color output. Next, we can do our normal. And here, I want to take these lines and I actually want to turn them, give them a normals value. So I'm going to go into my library and we will get a height to normal. The reason that's not working is we need to go back into this mask and assign that as a height value. Actually, no, you know, let's cheat. I'm going to get a transform node. And now it'll accept it. It's because these have been actually assigned, and it's saying that it's a mask value, but this is wanting a height value. In reality, all it really wants is a black and white. And by putting this transform node in between, I'm just kind of getting, I'm just passing it through there and it'll accept it now. It's simpler than going back in there. And we're eventually going to put a bit of a function on this one that will deal with the depth of these as we get more polished. But for the moment, let's just hook them up. And then we'll get the normal from here. And we'll do an overlay. Wow, that's really harsh. Seems to look okay. Next we have our height. I'm actually plugged that into the, we're not using it as a mask, we're using it for a blend. And next we have roughness. And again, for roughness, I'm gonna invert this, the line mask, because I actually want them, I want my deepest parts to be the least shiny. And here we'll use a lighten blend. So those white bits are going to be coming through. Next we have specular. This specular there. But here we'll use a darken blend, because these cracks, we don't want them to have any specularity at all. And finally, we have the ambient occlusion. And we actually need to make an ambient occlusion for our planks. And we'll set that height depth a little bit lower. And we can blend it with this one. And here we'll use a darken blend. So let's take a look at what this looks like. It's not too bad. Maybe go a little bit darker with this. No, I think, you know what I think? I think I want to go back to our planks and give it a bit more in the Y. I'm going to open this reference. And in here, we're going to go into this interstice Y and see what 0.04 looks like. Yeah, and then let's do the same thing here. Oh, actually, no, this one we don't want to do it because we don't want any spaces there. So that should actually fix that. Yeah, that's better, I think, because we can actually see the cracks everywhere now. Yeah, I'm pretty okay with that. So why don't we publish this out, save it as basic floor, and save it to our Unreal workspace, and take a look at what we've made in the engine. So let's import our material, and we'll let it create our material for us. And before I actually go messing with this, I'm going to go into the instance, and I'm going to turn on my specular level and my height. And then we can double click on the actual material and edit it here. So we just have to add those other two nodes. I'm going to go ahead and copy this and just paste out two of them. So we need one for our spec level. And it's turned it to a linear grayscale, which is good. And this one we'll have as our height. We're going to go into our material, and we're going to turn on the tessellation. And then I'm going to get a constant to plug into my tessellation multiplier, and I'll set it to 10. And now all we need to do is plug these guys in and save our material. And let's put our basic floor down and see what it looks like. Oh, you know what we need to do? We need to come in here and ramp that up. And this is at its roughest. Might actually be easier to look at if we apply it to this. But I'm liking the way that the light works on it. It's better than having it completely rough, and I like the height. It was, you know, before it was like completely flat, and I didn't like that. So we've got that height that we wanted. And it's not messing with the edges too much. It's doing it maybe a little bit. Let's see how it looks like when it's polished up. Yeah. I mean, there's a little bit of artifacting in here, but it doesn't really bother me. I mean, it is wood. It's not supposed to be perfectly flat. I think that's all right. Yeah. I'm going to call that a success. Obviously, you know, you can start to fine-tune this where it's looking like really super good. But all the elements are in place, and we can manipulate the polish, and that is affecting everything. And then, like I said, any of those other parameters that we've created, if you want, you can always expose those and have those be available for people to change. You know, I kind of like this medium one. This is nice. So that's that. So now you have this mask element that you can use not just for this wood you made, but for any wood. And I hope that's been helpful.